When you're born into a world that you don't fit in, it's because you were born to help create a new one. Ever since I've heard those words, I've always loved them. But what does it mean to be born into a world that you don't fit in? It can mean running into messages on a daily basis that say, you don't matter, you don't exist. But what happens when your gender identity can't be fit into neat little boxes? What do you fill out? Do you compromise your identity and confirm binary views about gender identity? Or do you leave it blank as a protest to opening up new eyes to visioning a new and more compassionate world? Well, this can be confusing as a lot of people shift and relate to their gender identity. But this confusion provides an opportunity to understand how people are claiming their bodies, self-determining their identities, and creating a world that they do fit in. In fact, you're part of that process, a gender identity revolution, and creating that world right alongside. So I ask you to think about this today. Has your relationship to gender identity changed over time? And even if you think it hasn't, stick with me because I'm going to walk you through this and we'll come back to it in the very end. So when somebody crosses gender norms, it can teach us a lot about our relationship to gender. This is gender identity. It's how somebody feels and relates to themselves and wants to be seen and validated in the world. Now, gender can also be the absence of gender, agender. Now, think of it this way. Have you ever been put in a position where you've had to defend or explain your gender identity? Well, if not, you're probably cisgender, which means that your gender identity matches the sex that was put on your birth certificate. This is complex, right? Yeah, I know. I've been trying to figure this out for over 40 years, and I still am. So when somebody crosses gender norms, it can teach us a lot about our relationship to gender. This is gender identity. Now, when you meet somebody whose gender identity is different than yours, it can make you challenge your own biases and assumptions. For instance, women might be considered as more emotional and passive, and men might be considered as more assertive and independent. Well, these pairings of the feminine masculine are the gender binary. But you see, the more people stray from those qualities and are policed back, they may deny or push away their authentic selves. You see, it's common to be unaware of the privileges conferred to you at birth because of your birth sex. But even if you are aware of those privileges, you may or may not be aware of the identity markers connected to your gender. But how many of you are in such distress about those identity markers that you question living? Well, some people are forced to think about that escape daily. When you don't have to think about it, that is cis privilege. Now, cis privilege also works this way. Have you ever been concerned when you've been given a form that if you don't check the box of the image that looks like you, that you might receive substandard medical attention, not be able to get your health care, your driver's license, your passport, or a visa? Or have you ever been concerned that your gender might impact your ability to travel nationally or internationally? Or even, have you ever been diagnosed with a mental illness, in this case, gender dysphoria, in order to have access to surgeries, medications, and hormones? Or even worse, have any of you been concerned about which bathroom to go into, that you might be yelled at, assaulted, or even removed? Well, saying no to these puts you in a position of cis privilege. You see, I don't have any of these privileges. And there are so many more that I could tell you about. I identify as trans agender. I don't identify with a gender at all. The way I relate to myself is agender. Now, the way I use the word trans is different than how some people might identify as transgender or trans. When I put trans with agender, as trans agender, I don't identify with gender or the gender binary. I'm just me, lowercase sj, no pronouns, no gender identity audit trail. Now, you might be thinking I look what has come to be perceived or constructed as male, but that has nothing to do with how I feel or relate to myself. Now, this dissonance has played out for me my entire life. But what I've come to understand is that the liberation from these distressors is bound up in how we relate to each other. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we know what we don't even know we should know? How do we know what we don't even know we should know? Now, dialing this question back into my early childhood in the 70s, nobody was talking about gender identity at all. It just wasn't on anybody's radar. There was no public or media presence, no role models, no books, curriculum, or policies. It wasn't even a form of discrimination, although gender was. And without a mirror that showed me I existed, I couldn't recognize myself. But you see, somewhere in that unknowing, in that invisibility, in that unrecognizability, I did feel vaguely recognized, but I just didn't have the language for it. So I turned outside of school to music, books, artists, and films. It was those spaces that placated the dissonance that I felt. And over time, when I went to graduate school, I came to understand that we have no understanding of what gender really is, that it's just a copy of a copy of a copy. And the more that we copy the same copy, the more we project gender norms. I mean, nobody knows what it feels like to be a gender. We've just been conditioned to do so. So while all I saw was copies, I was trying to find that image that fit me. Now, these experiences informed why I became a teacher and later a teacher of teachers. And I've come to understand how students are navigating ways through the school system. But you see, this both complicates and illuminates schools' preparedness. Because imagine this happening time after time again, beginning in early childhood and extending well into adulthood. Research has shown that when students with non-conforming gender identities are not validated and understood, they begin to shut down. And this puts them at risk for ongoing social, emotional, academic, and health consequences. Now, these consequences are unimaginable, and they may likely make you angry and uncomfortable. So, trigger warning. School systems tend to privilege cisgender students, and as a result, students with non-conforming gender identities experience higher than average rates of bullying, truancy, dropping out, lowered grade point averages, push out, mental health and substance abuse issues, presence in the foster care system, homelessness, pathways to prison, and suicide. In fact, statistics reveal that by the age of 20, 50% 50% of them will have tried to kill themselves. And statistics are far greater for students of color. They're all vulnerable for internalizing messages like ugly, useless, immoral, better off dead. They're stared at, moved away from, asked intrusive questions, referred to with inappropriate pronouns, names, and identities. They're forced to use a bathroom that doesn't comport with their gender identity. I mean, imagine what it would feel like to have to hold your bladder all day long because you were afraid to use the bathroom. I mean, any given day at school can leave these students completely exhausted and emotionally bankrupt. And this is just some of what they're forced to endure. You might be thinking there's more. Sadly, there's so much more. In fact, many resort to self-harm and cutting as a way to stop the internal hurt. Now, consider how difficult it would be to do well in your life, or anywhere for that matter, when so much of your time was spent trying to serve daily. I mean, wouldn't you leave a context too? Doesn't everybody have the right to feel good? Doesn't everybody have the right to feel treated with dignity? Now, in my research, I've discovered how students are developing coping strategies to preserve their spirits. They've developed what I call micro-sanctuaries, which are spaces outside of school where they can find love, comfort, and recognition in each other. These spaces have inspired the creating and recreating, the inventing and reinventing, the trying on and expansiveness of new claimed language and identity. In fact, there's a group of over 400 students with self-claimed and determined terms. They are expanding new knowledge. Now imagine the impact all of that new knowledge could have if it were integrated into the school system. Now that's the school I wish I had gone to 40 some odd years ago. Had I been validated and understood, I likely would not have tried to kill myself twice. Now, by this point, you might be wondering what you can do to insert yourself into this gender identity revolution. Well, regardless of your role or context, there are hundreds of strategies, but here's my favorite. Hi, my claim name is Cynthia. I am currently a cisgender, heterosexual female. My claim pronouns are she, her, and hers. How would you like me to refer to you? Well, by saying currently cisgender, it serves as a lighthouse that both recognizes and affirms the expansiveness of gender identity, and it invites somebody in to be more fully themselves. Now, in spite of everything I've shared today, I'm really not so worried because change is happening. But for those changes to last, we have to do this work way before youth come to school. We have to talk about it, ask questions, acquire resources, so that when they do come to school, we will be prepared to attend to the indeterminacy of gender identity. It takes about 40 years for the seeds of a revolution to make sustained changes. And this revolution is gaining critical mass. The more that society moves away from policing gender identity norms and opens up spaces for each of us to self-determine, not only will we become free to blossom into change agents who can help shape those compassionate leaders that we so desperately need, but all of our capacities to expand humanity are strengthened. So never doubt your role, because your efforts will forever change the course of humanity and, as a result, the world. I truly believe that as a collective, we can shape a more compassionate and kind world in which no person has to fear being erased or take their life. We are the gender identity revolution, and we are preparing the world now for those coming into it. Now, as I think about the hope, I do feel that the world will be more kind and socially just. I hope for that day when gender identity is no longer presumed, policed, positioned, called deviant, or has to be noted as a footnote, endnote, or hashtag. I hope for that day when students no longer have to define or explain themselves. I hope for the day when those who've been pushed to margin now feel safe to come to center. I hope for the day when those whose voices have been silenced are now heard. I hope for the day when perceptions are changed and not people. I hope for that day when the world can just be. And I hope for that day that Mr. Rogers hoped for. A day where everybody feels loved, cared about, and heard, and they can grow because they are accepted for exactly who they are. But I hope for that day when no one has to force themselves in order to fit into a box or a predetermined narrative, because the world, our world, your world, their world is now readied, steadied, and prepared for all of those coming into it. Thank you.